Why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor?
There is still disagreement among historians, military scholars, and investigators about why the island nation of Japan issued the surprise attack on the U.S. military installation at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Some believe that Japan had been baited into making the attack in order to marshal public opinion behind U.S. entry into World War II, 1939-45. Others maintain that the United States was unprepared for such an assault, or at least, the Japanese believed Americans to be in a state of unreadiness. And still others theorize that Pearl Harbor was an all-or-nothing gamble on the part of Japan to knock America's navy out of the war before it had even entered into the fray. These are the facts. In 1941, Japanese troops had moved into the southern part of Indochina, prompting the United States to cut off its exports to Japan. In fall of that year, as General Hideki Tojo, 1884-1948, became Prime Minister of Japan, the country's military leaders were laying plans to wage war on the United States. On December 7, Pearl Harbor, the hub of U.S. naval power in the Pacific, became the target of Japanese attacks, as did the American military bases at Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. But it was the bombing of Pearl Harbor that became the rallying cry for Americans during the long days of World War II, since it was at this strategic naval station, which had been occupied under treaty by the U.S. military since 1908, that Americans had felt the impact of the conflict.
Why was the fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory important to the labor movement?
The March 25, 1911, blaze, which killed 146 people, most of them women, prompted public outrage and led to the immediate passage of fire safety legislation and became a rallying cry for labor reforms. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the top 3 floors of a Manhattan office building. It was one of the most successful garment factories in New York City, employing some 1,000 workers, mostly immigrant women. But the conditions were hazardous, the space was cramped, accessible only via stairwells and hallways so narrow that people had to pass single file. Only one of the 4 elevators was regularly in service. The cutting machines in the workroom were gas-powered, scraps of fabric littered the work areas, the water barrels for use in case of fire were not kept full, and the no-smoking rule was not strictly enforced. In short, it was an accident waiting to happen. When the fire broke out on a weekend, the cause is unknown since the building was charred so badly. About half of the employees were there. Smoke and fire, however, were not the only causes of death in the panicked escape. People were trampled, fell in elevator shafts, jumped several stories to the pavement below, and were killed when a fire escape melted and collapsed. While the fire happened during a time of labor reform, Those reforms had not come soon enough to save the lives of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory employees, who had been subjected to extremely poor and dangerous working conditions. The disaster became a rallying cry for the labor movement. Tens of thousands of people marched in New York City in tribute to those who had died, calling attention to the grave social problems of the day. In New York State, the fire safety reforms for factories came right away. The legislature appointed investigative commissions to examine factories statewide, and 30 ordinances in New York City were enacted to enforce fire prevention measures. One of the earliest was the Sullivan-Hoye Fire Prevention Law of October 1911, which combined 6 agencies to form an efficient fire commission. Soon factories were required to install sprinkler systems. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire became an object lesson for the entire nation, prompting the consolidation of reform efforts. The much-needed labor reforms, which addressed the miserable working conditions, did not come until years later.
Who wrote the Quran?
The Quran, or Quran, contains the holy scriptures of Islam, and was written by the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, c. 570 to 632. It is not known whether these texts were written down during Muhammad's lifetime or after his death. It is known that the texts were codified, organized into a body, between 644 and 656. Muslims believe the angel Gabriel revealed the book to Muhammad, beginning in 610 and continuing until the Prophet's death in 632. The Quran, meaning recitation, consists of 114 verses, ayahs, that are organized in chapters, surahs. Muslims believe the beautiful prose of the Quran to be the words of God Himself, who spoke through Muhammad. Further, it is believed to be only a copy of an eternal book, which is kept by Allah. The Quran is also held up by Muslims as proof that Muhammad was indeed a prophet, since no human is capable of composing such text. Among the most widely read texts today, the Quran is also taught orally, so that even Muslims who are illiterate may know and be able to recite verses.
Who were the war hawks?
The Warhawks were a group of Republicans in the U.S. Congress who advocated war with Great Britain. Elected in 1810, the congressmen took office in 1811, the failure of the Erskine Agreement fresh in their memories. That bit of 1809 diplomacy, arranged by British minister to the United States George Erskine and the then U.S. Secretary of State James Madison, 1751 to 1836, would have provided for the suspension of Britain's maritime practices that interfered with U.S. shipping. But the agreement fell apart when Erskine was recalled from office. The relationship between the United States and Great Britain. Tenuous since 1807 due to trade embargoes and the impressment of American sailors into British service, deteriorated. The newly elected congressmen were tired of the failure of diplomacy to resolve maritime problems with the British. They further felt that the British were challenging the young United States through their policies, which purportedly included British aid to American Indians in the Northwest. Warhawk leader Henry Clay, 1777 to 1852, was named Speaker of the House. And Congress soon passed a series of resolutions to strengthen the Army and Navy. When Congress was called upon by President James Madison to declare war on the British in June of 1812, it was the Warhawks who swung the close vote. Thus the War of 1812 was declared. Some historians believe the true motive behind the Warhawks was not resolution of the shipping problems, but rather the desire to annex parts of southern Canada to the United States.
What happened in the anthrax scare of 2001?
The anthrax scare unfolded shortly after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. When news first broke that anthrax-laced letters were received at East Coast media outlets and U.S. congressional offices, there were fears that the spreading of the infectious bacterium was linked to the 9/11 attacks. But the investigation later pointed toward a domestic perpetrator, still unknown in mid-2005. According to a report from the Office of Homeland Security, the anthrax events began on October 2, 2001, when an infectious disease doctor in Palm Beach County, Florida, reported a suspected case of inhalation anthrax. That diagnosis was confirmed by the Centers for Disease Control, CDC, on October 4, and the information was released to the public, rattling the nerves of an already jittery nation. On October 5, the first victim of the anthrax attacks, the 63-year-old South Florida man who had been hospitalized, died. On October 7, investigators announced that evidence of the anthrax bacterium was found in his workplace. The Florida offices of American Media Inc., AMI, publisher of the National Enquirer, Sun, and other tabloids. On October 12, New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani announced that an NBC News employee in the office of anchorman Tom Brokaw had tested positive for cutaneous, skin, anthrax, a less dangerous form of the bacterium. 3 days later, it was reported that a letter containing suspicious powder was opened in the office of Senator Tom Dashley, South Dakota, in the Hart Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. The next day the powder tested positive for anthrax. October 16 brought the news that the infant son of an ABC News producer in New York City had tested positive for exposure to the skin form of anthrax. The baby had visited the ABC News offices weeks earlier, and officials believed exposure had occurred at that time. The same day, it was announced that a second Army worker, a 73-year-old mailroom employee, was diagnosed with inhalation anthrax and was in intensive care. The announcements brought the number of confirmed anthrax cases to 4, 2 inhalation and 2 cutaneous. Within days, CDC officials had linked all 4 cases to the intentional delivery of B. anthracis spores through mailed letters or packages. The FBI urged the public to handle any suspicious packages with care. To not open, smell, or taste them, and to call 911 immediately. On October 18, a worker at CBS News in New York was reported to have been infected with skin anthrax. The next day, the public learned that an editorial assistant in the Manhattan offices of the New York Post had also been diagnosed with the skin form of the disease. Also on October 18 and 19, the CDC confirmed diagnoses of both inhalation and cutaneous anthrax in New Jersey postal workers, who had begun showing symptoms of infection on October 13. Between October 19 and 22, 4 workers from a Washington, D.C. postal facility were confirmed to have been infected with inhalation anthrax and were hospitalized. On October 22, 2 of them died. 2 days later, the U.S. Postmaster General announced to the public, "There are no guarantees that the mail is safe," and he advised hand-washing after handling the mail. On October 31, a New York hospital worker died of inhalation anthrax, becoming the 4th fatality. But investigators could not determine how the woman had been exposed to the bacterium. By mid-November, traces of anthrax had been discovered in mail facilities that supplied the CIA. The Senate and House office buildings, the Supreme Court, Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, the White House. Washington, D.C.'s Brentwood Mail Processing and Distribution Center, Washington, D.C.'s Southwest Postal Station. A Kansas City postal facility, the Pentagon's post office, and 4 more New Jersey postal facilities. Antibiotics were distributed to thousands of workers as a preventive measure. On November 16, an anthrax-laced letter addressed to Senator Patrick Leahy, Vermont, was discovered in a batch of quarantined Capitol Hill mail. The handwriting, all uppercase, was similar to that in the letter addressed to Senator Dashley. And the 2 letters carried identical messages: September 11, 01/ "You cannot stop us/ we have the anthrax. / You die now. / Are you afraid / death to America. / Death to Israel. / Allah is great. The letters sent to the senators were postmarked October 9, 2001, in Trenton, New Jersey. The message and handwriting in those letters were also similar to those in letters addressed to the editor of the New York Post and to Tom Brokaw at NBC News, both of which read, September 11, 01/ "This is next / take penicillin sick now / death to America / death to Israel / Allah is great." The letters sent to the media outlets were postmarked September 18, 2001, also in Trenton, New Jersey. The Franklin Park, New Jersey return address was identical on all 4 letters. But it was a non-existent location. Investigators believed that whoever sent out the deadly missives was familiar with the area. On November 20 it was confirmed that an elderly Connecticut woman, who had died the day before, had been infected with anthrax. The 94-year-old was believed to have been exposed to a letter that had been cross-contaminated in the mail. All 5 anthrax deaths were caused by the inhalation form of the bacterium. In total, 22 cases of anthrax were identified between October 4 and November 20, 11 of them were the deadly inhalation form. 6 people survived, and 11 were the less serious skin form. In all but 2 cases, the New York hospital worker and the elderly Connecticut woman. The victims were mail handlers or were exposed to work sites that had been contaminated by mail. Investigators concluded that all of the anthrax spores were of the same strain, called Ames, but that the letters contained different grades of the bacterium. By November 9, 2001, the FBI had issued a behavioral/linguistic assessment of the offender based on the known anthrax parcels. The offender is believed to be an adult male who has access to a source of anthrax and possesses the knowledge and expertise to refine it. The FBI headed a multi-agency effort to identify the perpetrator of the deadly attacks.
Who was the first man to walk on the moon?
It was American astronaut Neil Armstrong, 1930, who, on July 20, 1969, stepped out of the lunar module from Apollo 11 and walked on the moon. Armstrong, who was joined by astronaut Edwin Buzz Aldrin Jr. 1930, uttered the famous words, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." The live voice transmission had dropped the "a" before man, but it was added in later.
What was Enron?
Enron was a high-flying energy trading and communications company headquartered in Houston, Texas. It was the 7th largest corporation in the United States, a favorite on Wall Street. And for 6 years in a row, 1996 to 2001, was named America's most innovative company by Fortune magazine. Then Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in December 2001. Rocking the business world and shocking investors and rank-and-file employees. It was, for a short time, the largest bankruptcy in American history. Federal investigators later learned that the company's collapse was caused by fraudulent accounting practices that allowed Enron to overstate earnings and hide debts. The conglomerate had booked billions in profits that did not really exist and created mythical companies to bury heavy losses. Enron's stock price plummeted, there were massive layoffs, employee retirement accounts heavily invested in Enron stock were decimated, executives resigned, and criminal indictments followed. Its accounting firm, Chicago-based Arthur Andersen, collapsed under the weight of its involvement in the scandal. Enron soon became emblematic of a much larger problem, the so-called breakdown of corporate America. It was the first of several colossal business failures, the biggest of which was the collapse of telecom giant WorldCom. In July 2002, WorldCom, valued at $180 billion and serving 15 million customers at its 1999 peak, filed for bankruptcy. WorldCom eclipsed Enron to earn the dubious title of largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. Again, fraudulent business practices were to blame. In March 2005, a federal jury convicted former WorldCom Inc. CEO Bernard Ebbers of engineering $11 billion in fraud. He was also found guilty of conspiracy and of filing false financial reports. The conviction was critical to prosecutors in a host of pending cases connected to corporate scandals, including Enron, whose former chairman, Kenneth Lay, and former CEO, Tom Skilling, were awaiting trial, set for 2006. A Fortune magazine writer reflected on the crisis of corporate ethics, saying, "Phony earnings, inflated revenues. Conflicted Wall Street analysts, directors asleep at the switch. This isn't just a few bad apples, it is a systemic breakdown." Enron happened to be first, and it became the symbol for the many. In 2005, Enron was in the process of distributing remaining assets to creditors and liquidating other operations. WorldCom, meanwhile, emerged from bankruptcy in 2004 as MCI Inc., the name of one of its subsidiaries.
What was the arms race?
The arms race refers to the buildup of nuclear weapons by the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. The race began on August 29, 1949, when the Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb. Prior to this, only the United States had the knowledge to build the atomic bomb.
President, how long must women wait for liberty?
And, more radically, Kaiser Wilson, 20 million American women are not self-governed. Their intent was to expose the government's hypocrisy. In April, the United States had entered World War I. 1914-18, in an effort to guarantee democracy abroad. Yet democracy did not exist at home, where the entire female population remained disenfranchised. In June, police began arresting demonstrators on minor charges, such as obstructing traffic. But the arrests did nothing to deter the suffragists. Upon their release from prison, they returned to protest at the White House gates. In all, 168 women, including Alice Paul, 1885 to 1977, and Lucy Burns, 1879 to 1966, of the National Woman's Party, were arrested. On the night of November 14, 1917, guards took 33 protesters to the Occoquan workhouse to be held. Previously, the women had been subject to forced feedings and solitary confinement at Occoquan. But this time new cruelties awaited them. They were beaten, dragged, choked, and handcuffed. Word leaked out about the atrocities committed at the workhouse. Less than 2 weeks later, a judge ruled that the women had been brutally treated. Yet they had done nothing more than exercise their constitutional right to free speech. The women returned to their fight, now with more weight of public opinion behind them. Nevertheless, it was 3 long years before the 19th Amendment was adopted, guaranteeing women the right to vote. In 1982 a historical marker was placed on the prison grounds in tribute to the brave women who endured Occoquan's night of terror.
Who were the Angles?
The Angles were yet another Germanic tribe. They originated in Schleswig in northwestern Germany. Like other Germanic peoples, they were on the move by the 5th century. Arriving in England, the Angles joined the Saxons, also a Germanic-speaking people. After which time they together became known as Anglo-Saxons, a term referring to any non-Celtic settler of Britain.
What was the Trojan War?
According to Greek legend, the Trojan War was a 10-year siege, c. 1200 BC, on the ancient city of Troy, also called Ilium. The Greek poet Homer, c. 850-BC, chronicled the Trojan War in his epic the Iliad. According to Homer, the Greek Mycenaeans, under their great king Agamemnon, set out to conquer the city of Troy. Situated on the Turkish coast at the southwestern part of the Hellespont. The Hellespont, now called the Dardanelles, and the Bosporus are narrow straits that connect the Aegean Sea with the Black Sea. As such, they are the gateway between Europe and Asia. And in Mycenaean times they held the key to control of the profitable Black Sea trade. In hopes of taking over that trade, Agamemnon's army attacked the powerful city of Troy, launching the decade-long campaign. The mythological war likely reflected a real war that was fought over the Dardanelles about 1200 BC.
What was the Chautauqua movement?
It was a cultural, religious, and political education movement that began in the 1870s and lasted into the 1920s. An estimated 45 million Americans participated in the Chautauqua, making it a dominant force in American life during its day. Theodore Roosevelt, 1858 to 1919, hailed it as the most American thing in America, and, during World War I, 1914–18, Woodrow Wilson, 1856–1924, claimed that it was an integral part of the national defense. Some scholars credit the Chautauqua movement with sowing the seeds of liberal thought in America. The movement began in 1874 at a Methodist Episcopal campsite on the shores of Lake Chautauqua, New York. There a young minister named John H. Vincent, 1932–1920, of Camden, New Jersey, endeavored to train Sunday school teachers in a summer camp atmosphere. The program grew in popularity and was expanded beyond Bible study and religious training to include lessons in literacy, history, and sociology. Chautauqua-style summer camps, commonly called Sunday school assemblies, began popping up across the nation. All of them featured a general meeting hall or pavilion set in a campground. By 1900 there were 200 pavilions in 31 states. Attendees of all ages would attend the summer programs, which featured speakers on a wide variety of subjects, including the arts, travel, and politics. Performances also became part of the movement, with a variety of musicians and entertainers joining the lecturers. Early in the 20th century the Chautauqua became increasingly secular, and went on the road as an organized lecture and entertainment circuit. Speakers and performers traveled from town to town, where tents were set up for weeks at a time to house the summer programs. Many Americans saw their first movies in Chautauqua tents. The movement died out in the mid-1920s, with the improvement of communications and transportations. Some consider the Chautauqua the first form of American mass culture. The Chautauqua Institute in New York continues to host a summer education program in the spirit of the original.
When was AIDS first diagnosed?
The first AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, cases were identified in 1981 by physicians in Los Angeles and New York City. Since that time researchers traced possible cases of the disease back to 1969. The human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, which severely damages the body's ability to fight disease, is transmitted through sexual contact, shared drug needles, and infected blood transfusions. While the disease was believed to have been transmitted somehow to humans from monkeys. Since research shows HIV to be similar to simian immunodeficiency viruses, HIV has never been isolated in any wild animal. While the source of the deadly disease has not been definitively determined, scientists believe that infection began in Africa during the 1960s and 1970s when significant numbers of people migrated from rural areas to cities. The overcrowding and unemployment that resulted contributed to the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. AIDS is now considered endemic to many developing nations, where it is spread mostly among heterosexual men and women. In developed nations, education programs have made the public aware of how the disease is transmitted. helping curb the spread of HIV. Drug treatments are still being developed to treat HIV/AIDS, no cure has been discovered. A 2004 report from the United Nations stated that there were 38 million people living with HIV in the world. Almost 70% of them in sub-Saharan Africa. The same report states that more than 20 million people had died since the first cases were identified in 1981.
What was the Church's role during the Middle Ages?
Though the Roman Catholic Church became increasingly involved in secular concerns during the Middle Ages. 500-1350, it played a much larger part in medieval European life. Missionaries converted many of the Germanic tribes, thus the Church was influential in civilizing these so-called barbarians. Further, churches throughout Europe housed travelers and served as hospitals for the sick. Monasteries and cathedrals became centers of learning.
Were the Pilgrims explorers?
The Pilgrims were early settlers who sought religious freedom and self-government in the New World. Since theirs was a religious journey, they described themselves as pilgrims. In fact, they were separatists, Protestants who separated from the Anglican Church to set up their own church. In 1609 they fled their home in Intrebari, England, and settled in Holland. Fearing their children would lose contact with their own culture, becoming assimilated into the Dutch culture, the group decided to voyage to America to establish their own community. In 1620 they arrived on the rocky western shore of Cape Cod Bay, Massachusetts. Their transatlantic crossing had taken 66 days aboard the Mayflower. 2 babies were born during the passage, bringing the number of settlers to 102, only some 35 of whom were pilgrims, the rest were merchants. On November 21 the Pilgrims drafted the Mayflower Compact, an agreement by which the 41 signatories, the men aboard the Mayflower, formed a body politic that was authorized to enact and enforce laws for the community. Religious leader John Carver, 1576–1621, was voted governor. Though their colonial charter from the London Company specified they were to settle in Virginia, they decided to establish their colony at Cape Cod, well outside the company's jurisdiction. By December 25 the Pilgrims had chosen the site for their settlement and began building at New Plymouth. The first year was difficult and the Pilgrims faced many hardships. 35 more colonists arrived aboard the Fortune, putting a strain on already limited resources. Sicknesses such as pneumonia, tuberculosis, and scurvy claimed many lives, including that of Governor Carver. And the merchants in the group challenged the purity of the settlement. Having secured a new patent from the Council of New England in June 1621, the lands of New Plymouth Colony were held in common by both the Pilgrims and the merchants. but this communal system of agriculture proved unsuccessful, and in 1624 William Bradford 1590 to 1657, who had succeeded Carver as governor, granted each family its own parcel of land. The Wampanoag Indians, who had previously occupied the land settled by the Pilgrims, proved friendly and were helpful advisors in agricultural matters. In 1626 the Pilgrims bought out the merchants' shares and claimed the colony for themselves. Though they were inexperienced at government before arriving in America and had not been formally educated, the Pilgrims successfully governed themselves according to the Scriptures. And Plymouth Colony remained independent until 1691, when it became part of Massachusetts Bay Colony founded by the Puritans.
What was populism?
A commoners' movement. In the United States, populism was formalized in 1891 with the founding of the Populist Party, which worked to improve conditions for farmers and laborers. In the presidential election of 1892, the party supported its own political candidate. The former, third party, Greenback candidate James B. Weaver. 1833–1912. Though Weaver lost, the Populists remained a strong force. In the next presidential election, of 1896, they backed Democratic Party candidate William Jennings Bryan. 1860–1925, a self-proclaimed commoner who was sympathetic to the causes of the farmers' alliances and of the National Grange. Reform-minded agricultural organizations, as well as the nation's workers. Bryan lost to William McKinley, 1843–1901, and soon after the election the Populist Party began to fall apart, disappearing altogether by 1908. Nevertheless, the party's initiatives continued to figure in the nation's political life for the next 2 decades, and many populist ideas were made into laws, including the free coinage of silver and government issue of more paper money, greenbacks, to loosen the money supply. Adoption of a graduated income tax, passage of an amendment allowing for the popular election of U.S. senators. The Constitution provided for their election by the state legislatures, passage of antitrust laws. To combat the monopolistic control of American business, and implementation of the 8-hour workday. Since the early 1900s, political candidates and ideas have continued to be described as populist, meaning they favor the rights of and uphold the beliefs and values of the common people.
What is Keynesian economics?
Keynesian economics are the collected theories of British economist and monetary expert John Maynard Keynes. 1883–1946, who in 1935 published his landmark work, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. A macroeconomist, he studied a nation's economy as a whole. Keynes departed from many of the concepts of a free market economy in order to ensure growth and stability. he argued that government needs to be involved in certain aspects of the nation's economic life. He believed in state intervention in fiscal policies. And during recessionary times he favored deficit spending, the loosening of monetary policies, and government public works programs, such as those of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, to promote employment. Keynes's theories are considered the most influential economic formulation of the 20th century. Having played a central role in British war financing during World War II, 1939–45. Keynes participated in the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, where he helped win support for the creation of the World Bank, which was established in 1945 as a specialized agency of the United Nations. The body aims to further economic development by guaranteeing loans to nations, extending easy credit terms to developing nations, and providing risk capital to promote private enterprise in less developed nations. It's interesting to note that Keynes was a key representative at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, where the Treaty of Versailles was drawn up, officially ending World War I, 1914–18. He quit the proceedings in Paris, returned to private life in London, and in 1919 published The Economic Consequences of Peace, in which he argued against the excessive war reparations that the treaty required of Germany. Keynes foresaw that the extreme punishment of Germany at the end of World War I would pave the way for future conflict in Europe.
What is the Miranda warning?
Familiar to many Americans from TV police dramas. The Miranda warning is a reading of the arrested person's rights. You have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court. You have a right to consult with a lawyer, if you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be appointed for you. Reading the defendant his rights became a requirement. After the 1963 trial of Escobedo Miranda, a Mexican, who was accused of rape, he was found guilty and sentenced to 20 to 30 years imprisonment. But Alvin Moore, Miranda's court-appointed lawyer, had revealed through his questioning of a police officer that the defendant had not been notified of his right to the services of an attorney. The same police officer had taken Miranda's written confession following 2 hours of interrogation. Moore, convinced that the confession should not have been admissible in court because of the procedural error of not informing the defendant of his rights, appealed the Miranda case all the way to the Supreme Court. On June 13, 1966, the High Court ruled, in a 5-4 decision, that Moore was right. Chief Justice Earl Warren, 1891–1974, reasserted that prior to any questioning a person must be warned that he has a right to remain silent, that any statement he does make may be used as evidence against him, and that he has the right to an attorney. Miranda's first trial was thrown out, and in 1967 he again stood trial in Arizona. But the prosecution secured new evidence. The testimonial of his estranged girlfriend that Miranda had confessed to her the rape he was charged with. He was convicted and again sentenced to 20 to 30 years in prison. Released on parole, Miranda died in a bar fight in January 1976. But police officers, the courts, and defendants still remember the importance of the case even if they can't recall Miranda's name or crime. Why is the ruling in Roe v.
When was the structure of DNA discovered?
In 1953, American biologist James Dewey Watson, 1928, and British biophysicist Francis Crick, 1916 to 2004, developed a model of the structure of DNA. Short for deoxyribonucleic acid, the acid found in cell nuclei. The scientists posited that DNA is constructed of a double helix, a spiral ladder, held together by hydrogen bonds. In reaching this conclusion, the pair relied on data gathered by British biophysicist Maurice Wilkins, 1916 to 2004. In the Watson-Crick model, each rung of the DNA ladder consists of two pairs of chemicals. When DNA is replicated, which it is during reproduction, the ladder rungs are divided and the legs form new ladders, identical to the original. The model has helped scientists understand how genetic traits are passed from parent to offspring. Cells in the human body have 46 chromosomes, arranged in 23 pairs. Children inherit half a set of chromosomes. Thread-like bodies in the nucleus of a cell, from each parent, and different combinations of the parent's DNA. A process called recombination produces offspring of different, though related, inherited characteristics. Each person's genetic information is carried in his or her DNA between 10 and 20 billion miles of it, which is distributed among trillions of cells in the average human body. The study of DNA's structure has proved invaluable to scientists working in the fields of evolution, pathology, forensics, and many others. DNA's fingerprinting ability is so powerful that forensic scientists can use the DNA found on a single strand of human hair to identify the owner. In 1962, Watson, Crick, and Wilkins shared the Nobel Prize for their groundbreaking work on DNA.
Why is the Kennedy presidency called Camelot?
The term was actually assigned by Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, 1929 to 1994. Shortly after President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, November 22, 1963. The former First Lady was talking with a journalist when she described her husband's presidency as an American Camelot, and she asked that his memory be preserved. Camelot refers, of course, to the time of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and has come to refer to a place or time of idyllic happiness. John Fitzgerald Kennedy's widow, who had with fortitude and grace guided her family and the country through the sorrow and anguish of the president's funeral, quite naturally held sway over the American public. So when she suggested that the shining moments of her husband's presidency were reminiscent of the legends of Camelot, journalists picked up on it. Despite subsequent revelations that there were difficulties in the Kennedy marriage, public opinion polls indicate that the image of Camelot, albeit somewhat tarnished, has prevailed.
What is Zionism?
Zionism was founded as the nationalist movement to establish an independent Jewish state. It began in the 1890s, and roughly 50 years later, in 1948. The movement's activism resulted in the proclamation of the State of Israel. Since that time, Zionism has focused its efforts on building bridges between Israel and Jewish people around the world. The roots of Zionism date to 1882, when a movement began encouraging Jewish settlement of Palestine. The region in the Middle East, in Southwest Asia, that borders the Mediterranean Sea to the west, Lebanon to the north, Syria and Jordan to the east, and Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, to the southwest. Groups advocating immigration to the Jewish homeland in Palestine called themselves Lovers of Zion. Hovevei Zion. Mount Zion is the site in Jerusalem where the Temple of David, king of the ancient Hebrews, d. 962 BC, was built, and it is therefore considered the center of Jewish spiritual life. As a political movement, Zionism was founded in the late 1890s by Austrian journalist Theodor Herzl, 1860 to 1904. In 1894, Herzl was among the reporters covering the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, a French army officer falsely convicted of treason. Though the artillery captain, who was Jewish, was later declared innocent. The guilty verdict rendered in his first trial was annulled. Many felt the Dreyfus case had exposed a deep vein of anti-Semitism in Europe. Herzl's conclusion was that if anti-Semitism could take hold in France, it could prevail anywhere. Based on this belief, he began working for the reclamation of a Jewish state in the Middle East. In 1897, Herzl convened the First Zionist Congress, held in Basel, Switzerland, bringing the movement to worldwide attention. In 1917, against the backdrop of World War I, 1914-18, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour, 1848-1930, issued a declaration vowing his country's support for a national Jewish homeland in Palestine. This came after British troops liberated the Middle East from the control of the Ottoman Empire. In 1920, the Ottoman Empire dissolved as part of the conclusion of World War I, and by international agreement the British were given rule over Palestine. Numerous Jews immigrated to Palestine, where fighting broke out with Arabs who opposed Jewish resettlement. Previously boosted by British support of an independent Jewish state, Zionists received a heavy blow in 1937 when, with another conflict in Europe on the horizon, Britain reversed its policy in Palestine in an effort to gain Arab support should fighting break out with Germany. At the end of World War II, 1939–45, Britain turned over the problem in the Middle East to the newly created United Nations, which decided that out of Palestine, both an independent Jewish state and a self-ruling Arab state should be formed. In 1948 the State of Israel was declared by Polish-born and Zionist moderate David Ben-Gurion. 1886–1973, who became head of the nation's provisional government. The World Zionist Congress was later separated from the government. The organization has since turned its attention to immigration and cultural activities. German-born scientist Albert Einstein, 1897–1955, was among Zionism's most prominent adherents.
Was King Tut the greatest ruler of ancient Egypt?
No, in fact, King Tut's reign was relatively unimportant in the vast history of ancient Egypt. A ruler of the 18th dynasty, Tutankhamun, c. 1370–1352 BC, was in power from age 9, 1361 BC. Until his death at the age of 18, a 9-year period that would be of little significance were it not for the November 1922 discovery of his tomb in the Valley of the Kings near ancient Thebes, present-day Luxor. Of the 27 pharaohs buried near Thebes, only the tomb of the minor king, Tutankhamun, was spared looting through the ages. Having not been opened since ancient times, the tomb still contained its treasures. In the antechamber, English archaeologist Howard Carter, 1873–1939, found more than 600 artifacts, including funerary bouquets, sandals, robes, cups and jars, a painted casket, life-size wooden statues of Tutankhamun, animal-sided couches, remnants of chariots, and a golden throne. In the burial chambers, a team of archaeologists discovered 4 golden shrines and the golden coffin containing the royal mummy of Tutankhamun, complete with a golden mask covering his head and shoulders. Earlier in his career, Carter had discovered the tombs of King Tut's predecessors, Queen Hatshepsut, c. 1520 c. 1468 BC, and King Thutmose IV, d. 1417 BC, both of whom were also rulers during Egypt's 18th dynasty.
What was the first big union?
The first national union of note was the Knights of Labor, founded by garment workers in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1869. Recruiting women, blacks, immigrants, and unskilled and semi-skilled workers alike. The Knights of Labor's open membership policy provided the organization with a broad base of support, something previous labor unions, which had limited membership based on craft or skill, lacked. The organization set its objectives on instituting the 8-hour workday, prohibiting child labor under age 14, instituting equal opportunities and wages for women laborers, and abolishing convict labor. The group became involved in numerous strikes from the late 1870s to the mid-1880s. At the same time, a faction of moderates within the organization was growing. And in 1883 it elected American machinist Terence Powderly, 1849 to 1924, as president. Under Powderly's leadership, the Knights of Labor began to splinter. Moderates pursued a conciliatory policy in labor disputes, supporting the establishment of labor bureaus and public arbitration systems. Radicals not only opposed the policy of open membership, they strongly supported strikes as a means of achieving immediate goals, including a one-day general strike to demand implementation of an 8-hour workday. In May 1886, workers demonstrating in Chicago's Haymarket Square attracted a crowd of some 1,500 people. When police arrived to disperse them, a bomb exploded and rioting ensued. 11 people were killed and more than 1,000 were injured in the melee. For many Americans, the event linked the labor movement with anarchy. That same year, several factions of the Knights of Labor seceded from the Union to join the American Federation of Labor, AFL. The Knights of Labor remained intact for 3 more decades, before the organization officially dissolved in 1917. By which time the group had been overshadowed by the AFL and other unions.
Who was Alexis de Tocqueville?
Aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville, 1805 to 1859, was only 26 years old when he traveled to New York with his colleague and friend Gustave de Beaumont, 1802 to 1866, to study and observe American democracy. Though Tocqueville set out with the pretext of studying the American penal system on behalf of the French government, both he and Beaumont were magistrates at the time. He had the deliberate and personal goal of conducting an on-site investigation of the world's first and then only completely democratic society, the United States. Tocqueville and Beaumont traveled for 9 months through New England, eastern Canada, and numerous American cities, including New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Baltimore, Maryland, Washington, D.C., Cincinnati, Ohio, and New Orleans, Louisiana. The pair returned to France in 1832 and the following year published their study on the penitentiary system in the United States and its application in France. Once this official obligation was behind him, Tocqueville left his post as magistrate and moved into a modest Paris apartment. There he devoted 2 years to writing Democracy in America, 1835-1840. The work was soon proclaimed the classic treatment of its subject throughout the Western world and secured Tocqueville's fame as political observer, philosopher, and, later, sociologist. Tocqueville proclaimed that during his travels, nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of conditions. All classes meet continually and no haughtiness at all results from the differences in social position. Everyone shakes hands. but he also foresaw the possibility that the principles of economic equality could be undermined by the American passion for equality, which not only tends to elevate the humble to the rank of the great, but also impels the weak to attempt to lower the powerful to their own level. While he warned against the possible tyranny of the majority as a hazard of democracy, he also added that law, religion, and the press provide safeguards against democratic despotism.
What were Voltaire's beliefs?
The prolific French writer's corpus of 52 works were produced as part of his lifelong effort to expose injustices. Voltaire's famous words, "Écrasez l'infâme, squash that which is evil," encapsulate his tenets. He believed in God, but abhorred priestly, high church, traditions. He spread the doctrines of rational skepticism to the world. He strongly advocated religious and political tolerance. And he held great faith in humankind's ability to strive for perfection. To the European literary world, he embodied the highest ideal of the Age of Reason, also called the Enlightenment. But victims of his wit feared and denigrated him. Celebrated by some during his lifetime, he has certainly been celebrated since. His masterpiece, Candide, 1759, a satirical tale exploring the nature of good and evil, has been translated into more than 100 languages.
Mitchell later said that as he sat thinking about the tragic news, he wondered to himself, "Here I am running around the world doing all these things, why not do them at home?"
Mitchell had spent his youth in Harlem, and he felt he should return there to establish a school to pass on his knowledge to others and to give black dancers the opportunity to perform. The primary purpose of the school was to promote interest in and teach young black people the art of classical ballet, modern and ethnic dance, thereby creating a much-needed self-awareness and better self-image of the students themselves. The idea was a success. During the 1970s and 1980s the company toured nationally and internationally, often performing to sell-out crowds and participating in prestigious events including international art festivals, a state dinner at the White House, and the closing ceremonies of the 1984 Olympic Games. Today, the Dance Theater of Harlem is acknowledged as one of the world's finest ballet companies. Not only did Mitchell succeed in giving black dancers the opportunity to learn and to perform, he effectively erased color barriers in the world of dance, testimony to the universality of classical ballet.
Who was Dolly the sheep?
Dolly was the first mammal cloned from the DNA of an adult animal. She was a Finn Dorset sheep born in 1996 and was hailed as a monumental scientific breakthrough when her birth was announced in early 1997. Scientists at Scotland's Roslin Institute used somatic cell nuclear transfer (SCNT), a reproductive cloning method, to produce the lamb, which carried the same nuclear DNA as the donor sheep. The cells were taken from the donor's udders. Dolly made headlines around the world and launched a public debate about the possibilities and ethics of cloning. Over the years, research groups around the world reported the cloning of mice, rats, cows, goats, rabbits, pigs, a horse, a mule, and a dog. In 2003, Dolly was put to sleep, though she lived only about half the expected 10 to 12-year lifespan for a Finn Dorset sheep. Scientists who conducted a post-mortem examination of her found that other than her ailments, arthritis and lung cancer, she appeared to be normal. The celebrity sheep was the mother of 6 lambs, which were brought into the world the old-fashioned way.
What is the doctrine of idols?
This was a phrase used by English philosopher Sir Francis Bacon. 1561–1626, in his written attack on the widespread acceptance of the thinking of ancient philosophers such as Aristotle, 384–322b. c. and Plato, c. 428–347 BC, and the founder of modern astronomy, Copernicus, 1473–1543. In his 1620 work, Novum Organum, Bacon vehemently argues that human progress is held back by adherence to certain concepts, which it does not question. By hanging on to these concepts, or idols, humankind may proceed in error in its thinking. The double edge is that in holding to notions accepted as true, we run the danger of dismissing any new notion, a tendency Bacon characterized as arrogance. A quality that goes hand in hand with arrogance is skepticism. In adhering to that which we know, we are likely to dismiss any new ideas. To combat these obstacles, Bacon advocated a method of persistent inquiry. He believed that humans can understand nature only by carefully observing it with the help of instruments. He went on to describe scientific experimentation as an organized endeavor that should involve many scientists and which requires the support of leaders. Thus, Bacon is credited with no less than formulating modern scientific thought.
What is the controversy over Tibet?
During the 7th and 8th centuries A.D., Tibet emerged as a powerful Buddhist kingdom. But beginning in the 13th century, it came under the rule of the Mongols. And in the 18th century the Manchu dynasty took control of the area. Beginning in 1912, Tibet again knew a brief independence. But in 1950 the country was invaded by Communist China. After years of turmoil, which included an anti-Chinese rebellion in 1959, Tibet was made an autonomous region within Communist China in 1965. But the autonomy is nominal. And Buddhist culture in Tibet has been all but destroyed. Buddhists fled Tibet, some of them taking refuge in India, which is where the current Dalai Lama, the 14th, leads a nonviolent struggle to free Tibet from China. In 1989 the Dalai Lama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts.
Why was the Internet invented?
The computer network was invented in the late 1960s so that U.S. Department of Defense researchers could share information with each other and with other researchers. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, developed the Internet, its users, who were mostly scientists and academics, saw the power of the new technology, wires linking computer terminals in a web of networks allow people anywhere in the world to communicate with each other over the computer. Even though it was developed by the government, the Internet is not government-run. The Internet Society, comprised of volunteers, addresses usage and standards issues. The technology caught on, made more accessible by the innovation of the user-friendly World Wide Web. In spring 2005 there were an estimated 888 million Internet users around the world. About 35% of them in Asia, 30% in Europe, and 25% in North America, about 200 million of those in the United States. The powerful network had become part of everyday life in the developed world.